Okay, welcome back to the asynchronous version of the Dissertation Writers Workshop. Again, this is meant to be an online equivalent to our in-person Dissertation Writers Workshop that we offer in the Writing Hub at UC San Diego. We're now at part 2. So in this part, we'll talk about a story structure for dissertations. In part 1, we went through in more general terms, what is a dissertation? So we explored the dissertation through genre, audience, and purpose. And now in part 2, we'll start thinking about how to organize a dissertation, how to organize what goes into the dissertation by focusing on telling a story. In addition to the videos in this resource, there's also a companion worksheet with a number of guided exercises and opportunities for exploration. We do recommend you engage with that worksheet, but remember, it's optional. You don't need to stress about it. Importantly, we do recommend you watch the videos in this order. What we are doing in each part of the video is building upon the information from the previous part. So do start with part 1 and watch the part 1 video if you haven't already. Okay, just to recap from part 1, we talked about ultimately that dissertations are strange genres. And so if you're feeling confused about the dissertation, it is not you and it's not just you. Dissertations themselves are weird. And that's because they combine genres, audiences, and purposes. The dissertation is the ultimate student paper plus a professional contribution. And the fact of both of those genres is occasioned by the liminality of the end of grad school and the beginning of your career. Remember that the dissertation sits in the overlapping space between the end of your student self as you get rid of and as you achieve this ultimate degree and the beginning of your professional self that you have been cultivating for several years in grad school. And so as you reach the end of grad school and you're at the end of your student life, you're also already a professional in this field and you are kind of navigating that liminality in the genre of the dissertation. There's 2 different audiences. There's the actual audience for the dissertation, which is your committee, but that actual audience adopts the mindset of an implied audience, i.e. other professionals in your field, to assess both aspects of the genre or both purposes of the genre. And that is, one purpose is to show that you've sufficiently earned the degree and can also, the other purpose, hold your own in this professional community, that you've learned as a student, but also that you can engage as a professional. So the dissertation is trying to achieve both of these purposes. So now we're at part 2, thinking about a story structure for the dissertation. Now that we know what a dissertation is, we're going to ask, what does the whole dissertation do and how is it organized? So we zoomed way out in part 1 to think about what is dissertations. Now we're going to zoom slightly in. We're still going to keep a big picture perspective, but we're going to think about what does the whole document have to do? What makes a dissertation complete? And how can you organize a dissertation so that it's coherent and easy to read and perhaps even fun to read and fun to write? The key for this part of the resource and the key for part 2 is to focus your attention on telling a story. Why is that? We tell ourselves stories in order to live. I love this quote because I think it's really true. Stories are really important for how humans have evolved to think. So I'll talk about why this is, how this relates to research stories in just a moment. But if we think more broadly about stories and the role stories have played in human evolution, we are actually programmed to understand and remember things better when that information comes to us in the form of a story. Stories are easier for us to process. It helps us understand and recall the information more quickly and more easily and more accurately when it comes in the form of a story. Stories also provide us context to care. So think about something that you didn't know a lot about, but once you heard a story about it, or once you heard a story about a person in that space or in that situation or circumstance, you might have cared a lot more. That's because stories provide us crucial context in order to make sense of details. And those details without context are harder for us to connect to. So stories provide an overarching context. And when it comes to research stories, those same things are true. Research stories are easier to process. When you frame what happened in your research and the findings that you have, or when you're framing conversations that are happening in your field through a narrative structure, it's easier for your reader to understand and process that information. It also provides them context to care. So in your dissertation, you'll be exploring lots of details about your research project, about other literature in your field, and a narrative structure helps provide your reader with enough context to see the relevance and importance of those details. It sets the stage for them and it pulls them in. So you don't need to tell the entire story of your dissertation in the introduction, but in the introduction chapter of your dissertation, you do sort of preview the entire plot of the dissertation. And so every dissertation has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning of every story provides the reader with a setting, as well as a motivating challenge that drives the rest of the action in the rest of the story. In your research story, the beginning of your story is going to be the existing research or literature that is meaningful for understanding your work and for establishing your research challenge. Towards the end of the introduction, you signal the challenge, your research puzzle, the thing that, if addressed, would make a difference for the field. Don't worry, this will all become clear as we go through part 2. Toward the end of the dissertation, the end of a research story, you resolve the challenge that motivated the action. So what you contribute to solving the puzzle and the new questions and directions that are generated from that resolution. So we'll keep exploring this, but what I want you to remember going forward in this video is the most important thing is telling a story, and every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So here's a very simple story structure. This does not follow a plot diagram with rising action, climax, falling action, or anything like that. This is just a very, very basic story structure. So roll along with me as we explore a story structure using The Hunger Games, an example of a story that you might be familiar with. And if you haven't seen The Hunger Games, spoiler alert. So most stories start out with the opening context, or they give us a world of the story or a setting. And that setting and that opening context gradually narrows towards a central challenge or problem. We start to see what's happening in this world, and we start to see that there's some central issue that is going to be at the heart of this story. At some point, that issue becomes clear and present. It is made very clear. This is the issue, this is the challenge. So moving to the Hunger Games example, if you've read the Hunger Games or if you've seen the film, you know it starts out with this kind of dystopian future in a world called Pan Am, and there's 12 districts as well as a capital. We learn about this thing called the Hunger Games, and we learn that it was a kind of retribution for an insurrection that occurred. And then as this world narrows, we learn about our characters, Katniss Everdeen, and the place where she lives. And then there's a moment where there is a clear and present challenge, and that comes in the form of the reaping, which is when they choose participants to participate in the Hunger Games, and our main character's sister is chosen, and almost instinctively she responds that she volunteers as tribute in her sister's place. So notice, if we think about this as a story structure, what has happened to us as the audience? We were given a world, and that world and context gradually narrowed toward a particular problem. And at some moment, that problem or challenge became clear and present. It was crystallized in a moment. Then typically what happens in a story is the characters answer the challenge in some way. They might prepare for a journey, they might plan their attack, they might plan their heist, they have to do something to address and answer the challenge. So in the Hunger Games example, Katniss Everdeen as well as Peeta are sent away on a train. There's coaching involved. There's different kinds of training exercises. They learn how to get sponsorships for when they're in the arena. And all of this is Katniss Everdeen answering the challenge of participating in the Hunger Games in her sister's place. And then the bulk of the story occurs as the characters engage in actions, and those actions generate understanding for those characters. From those understandings, they can engage in more actions, which create more understanding. So to the Hunger Games again, right, we see that Katniss learns about other opponents that she's competing against. She learns how to interact with the dome or the system that the Hunger Games is in. She understands and learns the weaknesses and the strengths of that system. She has to outlast others in very brutal ways. And at the very end, they are both ready to eat the berries. And that's a sort of critical understanding that Katniss has built over time based on her observations of the game master and the system and all of these things. So in a other kind of story structure, we might outline this as a plot with rising action and climax and all of that. But for now, we're just going to collapse all of that complexity into action and understanding. And then at the end of a story, we see that there's the challenge is resolved, or at least it's partially resolved. And from that resolved challenge, the context or the world of the story has changed. It's new somehow. So in the Hunger Games example, Katniss and Peeta both live, which is strange. And now we're left asking, well, now what? So the challenge of our character, Katniss Everdeen, engaging in the Hunger Games, that has been resolved. That's finished. But now there's new questions. There's a new context, and that will set up the story to continue. Your research story is not the Hunger Games, although sometimes it might feel like it, and that's okay. But if we think about your research story or your research as this in a kind of story structure way, a narrative structure, we can see it can follow a very similar pattern. You can start out your dissertation by establishing context for your reader. Start building the world of your research area and gradually narrow that world to reveal that there is a clear and present knowledge problem. And you can clearly articulate that knowledge problem. And by knowledge problem, all I mean is that you will make an argument that there is insufficient knowledge or insufficient understanding about some topic. That is a very broad argument, and you can specify and narrow that argument in very particular ways. But what you're generally arguing at the beginning of a research story is that there is an insufficient amount or insufficient knowledge on a particular topic. But you have to build a world for that research and narrow that context toward the knowledge problem so that your reader can see it. And then after clearly articulating the problem, you typically can engage in a rhetorical answering to that challenge or answering the problem. So this is where you might review your method, your research design, the study that you conducted, the data that you have, or the data that you collected, or the materials that you used. So that's all part of answering the challenge. And then typically, whether in a research article or in a dissertation, there are sub-analyses that reveal understandings, particular kinds of understandings that resolve or help us understand some aspect of the knowledge problem. So there are smaller arguments made to help us understand some aspect of the challenge. And then the conclusion of a research story usually signals what is resolved about the knowledge problem, what has yet to be resolved about that knowledge problem. And it also establishes new questions that from this new information, from these new understandings, here's what else might happen. Here's what else we might ask. Here's what happens now. Now what? So this structure is actually quite similar to what a lot of us are used to when reading research writing or when writing those projects. What we're used to is a kind of IMRAD structure, which stands for intro, methods, results, and discussion. So if you look at this, you can see that what we're used to writing actually already follows a narrative structure. So let's keep that same structure, but change the words. So OCAR stands for opening, challenge, action, resolution. So if we think about it, our introduction and lit review sets up context and establishes a challenge that is a knowledge problem. Then we answer that challenge in the methods, the M in IMRAD. And then the resultant findings become the basis of the actions that we took, i.e. the data that we collected and the analysis that we ran on that data, and then the understandings that we can generate from those actions. And finally, the resolution of that challenge comes in the discussion and conclusion section. That's where we bring our reader back to the opening context. We remind them of the challenge we are trying to address and what we did to address that challenge, the understandings that we can generate from what we did, and then we resolve that challenge, even if we resolve it only partially. So here it is, the narrative structure for your entire dissertation. Notice that it is the same diagram. You have the opening context and challenge at the top, answering the challenge toward the middle, but in the middle of the narrative structure, instead of having one space where there's action and understanding, there's 3. So this is what I would call the chapters, the substantive chapters of your dissertation. You might have 3 substantive chapters. You might have 2, you might have 1, you might have more than 3. It all depends on your department, your program, and your particular research context. But I'm using 3 as just a basic example here. So what you would see in a dissertation story is that in the introduction, you would have the same kind of story building where you would set up an opening context and a challenge for your reader. You would narrow that context toward the challenge, and then whether in the introduction or in a methods chapter or perhaps in the methods appendix, you show what you will do or what you did to answer that challenge and to solve the knowledge problem that you set up for the reader in the beginning. Then your substantive chapters work through different actions and understandings that you can generate for your reader. The resolution to the challenge comes in the conclusion chapter, where you also can set up the sequel, i.e. your future research that you will do after the dissertation. So again, the context is broad theoretical foundations that you're building on, and you narrow those towards a clear and present problem, answering the challenge in the form of a unified research agenda, what catalyzed this process of researching this topic, and what the dissertation as a whole does to further your research agenda. The chapter is united, each chapter is united by a complex challenge, but they might use different data, different experiments, they might pull different papers or different analytical frameworks on the same data, but each chapter does something specific to address the challenge. Each adds a different understanding. We're going to talk more about navigating between the substantive chapters of your dissertation in part 3 of this resource. And again, the resolution is how we might resolve the knowledge problem in light of what is now known. What's important about this structure is that all of these pieces, whether it's your introduction, your methods, the substantive chapters, or your conclusion and discussion chapter, they all need to be in service to the same story. And that's why it's important to make critical choices about what is essential or not essential to include in the dissertation. If you have a potential substantive chapter that is really interesting, but does not fit at all with the broader story you're trying to tell, you can consider leaving that out. It doesn't mean it was useless, and it doesn't mean you won't go back to it later. It just means that you'll use it in a different genre. You'll use it to tell a different story. But for this story, you can leave it out and have something else that is in line and in service to the same story that you are building. So the context provides space for understanding the challenge. That challenge then motivates and unites the ensuing actions that you took in your research, and those yield understandings. From those understandings, we can address or resolve the original research challenge that you set up through the context at the beginning. So remember, this is like a completed circle, and all things have to work to be in service of the same story. It's important now to add a word of caution, because sometimes the context and the challenge that you thought you were researching may have shifted. I like to say to be careful when opening the overhead research bins. When you set out in this dissertation process You started with a research proposal and you talked about potential challenges that you wanted to explore. You set up a knowledge problem in your research proposal. That knowledge problem was the basis for proposing your research study. But then you actually went and did that research. But don't feel like you have to base your dissertation on what you thought you were doing before you started. For almost every single researcher I have ever known, what they thought they were researching before they started researching turns out to be not what they researched at all. Because once you're in the research, whether you're doing field work or doing analyses of different kinds of data, once you're actually doing the research, you see things that you could have never anticipated from the outside before you started. So instead of feeling pulled to write a dissertation that follows up on your research proposal, remember these are two different projects and two different genres. You should write a dissertation that uses and makes sense of the work you actually did and the data you actually have. So in other words, in the language of a narrative, generate understandings from the actions you actually did, from the actions you undertook as the research agent. It's okay if your dissertation ends up being about something other than what your proposal did or what your proposal was about. You can navigate that with your advisor, with your committee, and with your department. Most of the time, though, what you thought you were studying and the context and challenge that you set up for your reader in your research proposal will have shifted by the time you complete your dissertation research, because that's what research is for. Research is about honing our understanding and narrowing it and making it more specific and precise. And that's okay. So it's okay if the context and challenge that you set up at the beginning when you propose this research has shifted. Be careful when opening the overhead research bins, but write a dissertation that uses and makes sense of the work you've done and the data you have, not the data you thought you might have and the questions you thought you might be asking at the beginning. So at this point, I've already overviewed this a couple of different ways, so allow me to just repeat it for the sake of completion and comprehensiveness. Your intro and or your background chapter. Different departments will call these things different things. So this might be an intro chapter. This might actually be 2 chapters. If your program has an intro chapter and a literature review chapter, that would both be here. But this is anywhere where you're providing background for the study and background for the dissertation. So this grounding literature is going to be used to build toward a central knowledge problem. And you will signal in this chapter how the dissertation addresses the knowledge problem. Sometimes you'll also give a roadmap for how the reader will experience the ensuing chapters in the dissertation. If you have a separate methods chapter, this is where you're answering the challenge. You're showing how this particular challenge motivated this particular research project. And so here's where you're going to overview the research you conducted, how you collected information, how you analyzed data, and remember that the actions that you take and how you answer the challenge needs to be aligned with the challenge that you faced or the challenge that you set up at the beginning of the dissertation. In the middle of the dissertation, the majority of the dissertation are substantive chapters. Again, you might have 1. If you have 1 findings chapter, you might have 3. If you have 3 main chapters, you might have more than that. But no matter how many we're talking about, the substantive chapter or chapters of your dissertation makes arguments or sub-arguments about the central challenge. It brings in evidence from your research and relevant sub-literatures to help explain or contextualize the sub-analysis and the sub-arguments you're making as needed. And finally, in the conclusion chapter, you'll discuss what we now know about the knowledge problem because of the research and because of the understandings that you discuss in the substantive chapters. And then you'll set up the sequel, or you'll sort of signal how the context and the world can be changed. So how we can apply or extend that knowledge, what is still unknown, and what we can do next. So again, we'll talk more about substantive chapters in part 3, but the important thing to keep in mind with the substantive chapters is you might need additional literature, and you will certainly need evidence from your research in these chapters. Remember that each substantive chapter is making a sub-argument, and so you might need additional contextualizing literature for each of those sub-arguments. And if that's not in the intro chapter, that's okay. You can bring in meso-level literatures at this level. These can also be papers you've already published or articles that you intend to publish or coordinated chapters. So if you intend to write a book dissertation, you can coordinate all of these chapters to work together in your future book manuscript, or you can assemble these from papers you already have in progress or articles that you intend to publish after the dissertation. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in part 3. The most important thing to remember when you're thinking about how to assemble this middle part of your dissertation, which is the main part of the story, is that they all need to stay in alignment. They need to be in service to the same story. And by that, I mean they all need to be connected to the research challenge that you establish at the beginning of the dissertation. So here's all of it at once again. Notice that we've kept the same story structure that is built on a challenge and how the context sets up that challenge at the beginning, but we've merely translated what it will look like in terms of the chapters of your dissertation. So here's what it could ultimately look like. And I want to add a quick disclaimer that your results might vary, but what your dissertation could ultimately look like is 5 distinct sections, which for the rest of this resource, I will call them chapters, but they might be sections. So by section, I might mean that your intro section is 1 chapter, or it could be the combination of an intro and lit review chapters, but that still will form 1 distinct section. So you have an intro section, either an intro chapter, a combination of chapters that establish the context and the challenge of the story. You'll also have a conclusion section that will resolve the challenge at the end. And in between, you'll have 3 substantive sections or 3 chapters, and I'll call those your data chapters. You can introduce the methods that you used in each distinct chapter, or you can have a separate method section, whether it's a methods chapter or a methodological appendix that kind of overview the details of how you answered the challenge in terms of your research design and your research plan. But you'll have 5 distinct sections: an intro, 3 substantive data analysis sections in between, and then a conclusion. As I mentioned, and as we will keep exploring in part 3, your data chapters are distinct but united. And the intro and conclusion chapters or sections, they're more like academic conversations. They provide context and they make the threads that unite the chapters more apparent. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in part 3. And so sometimes people ask, well, where does the literature go? Where does the literature go? Where is the literature review? You might have a literature review with or next to following your introduction. And that's the kind of meta-literature that is applicable to most things in your dissertation. This meta-literature is important because it's how you set up the context for your research problem and how you establish yourself as part of the conversation. In part 1, we talked about that the dissertation has to make a contribution to the research culture. And this meta-literature and building in the meta-literature as part of the context building is an important part of doing that, of making a contribution. But in addition, you can have literature that is useful for particular chapters or particular substantive sections. So whether that's a finding section or a particular chapter that's about your data and is exploring findings from your data. You can also have meso-literature that shows up in the substantive data chapters because that literature will help contextualize or explain or make sense of things that you find relative to that particular chapter. Even if it's not relevant to the entire dissertation, it can be relevant for that particular chapter. So as I mentioned in part 1, my dissertation explored veteran-focused charities in the United States. And one chapter that I had in my dissertation was about gender and gender dynamics and gender expression in the veterans-focused sector. And that gender literature wasn't necessarily relevant to my entire dissertation. There was other grounding meta literature that I wanted to use, but it was interesting and helpful and useful for that one chapter on gender dynamics in the sector. So that's a kind of meso literature example. I want to say that this is one approach. Dissertations can and do often vary. The most important thing to remember is that the dissertation is yours. You can navigate between the expectations of your advisor and your department and other authority figures and what you want to write as an independent professional contribution that has your name on it. So you can talk with your advisor about getting the balance right between writing a passable dissertation as well as writing a good dissertation that is also a dissertation you want to write. So talk with your advisor about what the structure of your dissertation could look like. How should the chapters be organized? What should each chapter do? Can you combine certain chapters in order to achieve a different kind of rhetorical purpose with that chapter? Where should the literature go? Talk with your advisor about how you can organize the dissertation. And remember, it has your name on it. The dissertation is yours. You are an active participant in negotiating what the finished product can look like. But here's one way that it could look. So let's say you've navigated this and with your advisor and you want to start writing a dissertation that is based with a story structure. How do you begin? Where do you start? Well, the good news and the bad news is it's up to you. You can begin in a lot of different ways. So for example, you could start by creating a research space in the context of the existing literature of your field. Sometimes I call this building yourself a U-sized niche and then filling that niche with your research project. Lots of us are familiar with starting projects this way because we are used to writing the introductions of our papers first. So it would be a very similar kind of thing where you would start with the introduction of your dissertation and build yourself a niche, build yourself a knowledge problem that your research is particularly suited to fill. From there, you can talk about how you address that knowledge problem in your study design and in the data that you collected or in the material that you'll be analyzing. And from that, you can break apart into different understandings, again, different sub-analyses about the knowledge problem that you've set up. And then you can go back to the context and make sure you're delivering on the promise, or you can adjust the promise you make in the beginning so that you can definitely be sure to be delivering on that promise by the time you get to the substantive chapters of your dissertation. But you could also start down here. You could start by looking at your data or looking at your analytical material. If your discipline doesn't call it data, that's fine. Start by looking at your analytical material and think about 3 sub-stories you can tell, things that you know you can tell based on your data and material. So you can start with articulating what these 3 things could be. Then from there, you can go up and again, build yourself a niche that you can actually fill. So you can start by thinking about what context could you build and how could you narrow that context to arrive at a challenge that sets up these 3 stories nicely. And then from there, you can articulate how you address that knowledge problem and then come back to those 3 stories. You could also start here. You could start with what you know you did in your research, the question you thought you would answer versus the questions you actually are able to answer based on your data or your analytical material. And from there, you could either start building yourself a niche, so start creating context that will narrow towards a knowledge problem that sets you up nicely based on what you actually did. Or alternatively, based on what you know you did, you can start with your method and your study design and then start articulating 3 possible mini stories or sub-analyses you can tell, and then go back up and build yourself a knowledge problem that sets you up to tell those 3 stories. So the good news and the bad news is that you can start in any of these places. There is a freedom to that, but that can also be challenging sometimes if you're feeling unsure where to begin. So if you are feeling unsure where to begin, think about which aspects of this diagram feel most interesting and exciting to you. Do you want to start building context toward a knowledge problem? Do you want to start thinking about just the research you did and taking stock of that? Or do you want to start by thinking about 3 possible data-driven stories that you could tell, mini stories that you could tell? Whichever one of those seems most interesting, start there. But I do recommend you leave the resolution or the conclusion for last. I do recommend ending with the conclusion. What's important to remember about your dissertation story is that it will be built, not found. There's no code to crack in your data. There's no single story you can tell about your dissertation from your data. Your dissertation story is not out there waiting for you to discover it if you just run another experiment or analyze your data another time or do another model. It's not out there waiting for you to be found. It's built, not found. So you will build your dissertation story brick by brick, one piece at a time. And in that process, you will realize there will be things that don't work, that actually you need to change the direction that you thought you were going in because there's more bricks over here that you need to integrate. And that's okay. There's both freedom and responsibility that comes with being the author of this world. You get to create this world that your reader will experience. And so there might be some false starts with that. There might be some wrong turns and you have to make a U-turn sometimes, but that's okay. You will build this story one piece at a time. You won't necessarily find it waiting for you in your data. Likewise, you can only tell one story. So there will be lots of topics, ideas, data, or potential directions that will get left out. And again, that's okay. You can keep track of those directions, keep track of those ideas and that other data or that material, and you can plan for the sequel, or you can plan for an offshoot of an additional research project or an additional writing project from that information. You don't have to lose it and it wasn't a waste. It just means it doesn't work for this one particular story, and you can hold on to it and use it later for a different story. So you'll build the story through writing and revising as you go, and you will streamline this story and make sure you're telling one story, not all of them, again, through writing and reading and revising as you go. So at this point, I would like to invite you to look at part 2 of the companion worksheet, and you can either draw out this narrative diagram, or there are different prompts in the worksheet for opening, challenge, action, and resolution. And I'd like you to give it a try. Start thinking about possible ways that you could organize your dissertation research into this narrative structure. Use the structure as a thinking tool. It's not necessarily a roadmap or a formula, and it's also not a cage. If you already know what your dissertation is about, try visualizing it this way. See if you see something new in your dissertation research once you start thinking about it as a story in a narrative structure. But if you don't know what your dissertation is going to be about, and if you're already trying to figure out what your dissertation is going to do and how it's going to be organized, try visualizing it this way. Try visualizing the kind of context you want to set up, the knowledge problem you want to argue exists, how your research and the stories you can tell from your research are going to contribute to understanding that knowledge problem. Try putting it into this visual narrative structure. Remember, you won't be locked into that path. It's just a thing to try. So at this point, we're at the end of part 2. Do take a moment to look at the companion worksheet and try fitting your dissertation ideas into an OCAR or narrative structure for telling a story. And when you're ready, move on to part 3.